The Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Tianjin ended without the breakthrough that the Kremlin so badly wanted to bring home in a nice package. Instead of a firm contract for the power of Siberia-2 gas pipeline, there was only a legally valid but vague memorandum without price or deadlines. China made it clear that Russians can build the power of Siberia-2, but the prices and money are still up to us. Instead of a big door to the Chinese market, there is a year of visa-free testing for Russians, which Beijing can close with a single move, instead of an equal axis of cooperation. A protocol detail that few people in Russia are commenting on right now, but everyone has noticed. Xi Jinping did not wait for dictator Putin for the group photo at the end of the summit. Amid the showcase, what is truly impacting Moscow? Russia is forced to further lower oil prices for China and India because logistics are getting more expensive, processing is stopping, and buyers are bargaining hard because they understand that Russia doesn't have much of a choice. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is September 2nd on the calendar. Let's sum up the results of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in the context of the relationship between China and Russia. And before we begin, I want to note that this YouTube channel releases 5 news stories every day, so you don't miss any key news. That's why I recommend subscribing to this channel and be sure to leave your like. So now let's go through everything step by step. I'll start with a quote from Xi Jinping, who said, "We reject the logic of bullying, where the strong dictate to the weak, and we propose an organized multipolar world. Fewer sanctions, more trust, free trade, settlements in national currencies, and secure supply chains." This long formula sounded like a manifesto for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, and at the same time like a technical assignment for banks and corporations within China. Basically, you can work with Russia, but only under Beijing's umbrella and according to Beijing's rules. Putin repeated his usual stance, saying peace talks on Ukraine are needed, but only if the West's mistakes aren't acknowledged. Talks will stay talks. Russia is open to dialogue, but not to ultimatums. Well, and then in the same spirit, there was such a peace-loving gesture toward the West from Putin. Putin stated that Russia has never opposed Ukraine joining the European Union, but added that NATO is a completely different matter. And these quotes are important in their entirety because they show how the Kremlin tries to attach its supposed rationality to the Chinese anti-hegemony line. But what's interesting is that Xi Jinping, when he says that they reject the logic of bullying, where the strong dictate the rules to the weak, is basically contradicting himself. Because China, as the stronger side, is now dictating the rules of the game to the weaker one, meaning Russia. Let's further analyze the mechanics of what they managed to agree on and what they didn't. The first thing is gas. Everyone in Russia was expecting that Putin would return with a huge contract for power of Siberia-2, that Russia would be able to pump huge volumes of gas to China, thus supposedly making up for losing the European market. But in fact, what we got was an announced increase in supplies from Russia to China by 8 billion cubic meters, but through existing routes. And as you understand, this is basically just cosmetic compared to the Europe that Russia has lost. Formally, it sounds nice, and there's a legally binding memorandum on power of Siberia-2, but without a price and schedule, it's not a contract, just a token. What happened? The thing is, Putin really wanted Xi Jinping to say again that they are ready to complete the power of Siberia-2 gas pipeline in order to receive an additional 50 billion cubic meters of gas per year from Russia. But China has been rejecting this idea for a long time now, and for several years in a row has been saying that they don't need this pipeline. But it was very important for Putin to get the Chinese to say that, in principle, they are against this project. That's what he achieved. China stated that, in principle, they are not against the construction of the power of Siberia-2 gas pipeline, but they don't need it right now. We don't need the volumes of gas from Russia that you're offering us. We're willing to increase gas supplies by up to 8 billion cubic meters, but only through existing pipelines. For the power of Siberia-2, once it's built, we're open to buying gas through it in the future, but we'll set the purchase price, not you as the seller. Well, basically that's the formula that China has been dictating for several years now, and then Putin brings this formula back to Moscow. And Russians are very happy about it, but China deliberately doesn't close this formula. It has liquefied gas from Qatar from Australia, and domestic gas production in China is increasing. And accordingly, it's unlikely that China needs the volumes of gas that Moscow is offering, especially considering the volumes of gas Moscow used to sell to Europe. And Moscow, having lost its European anchor, is rushing to sign at least something to show some progress. Beijing is in no hurry. And that's what explains the difference in tone overall. Russian speakers say this is a historic step, while Chinese speakers say it's an important stage in joint work. When it comes to oil, this loud talk about multipolarity just turns into empty words. Strikes on oil refineries in Russia, accidents at these plants, force majeure situations and so on are pushing Russia to export more crude oil. Margins are lower and insurance risks higher. India and China notice Russia's internal crisis and are demanding a larger discount. Here's a quote that Chinese traders are using right now. Bloomberg is writing about this. We are not philanthropists. For every point of risk, a point of discount. There's no transparent insurance, so we buy cheaper. We're not ready to cover your repair risks. Take them on yourself. This is the quote that drives the market, not propaganda. So the Chinese are openly stating, listen, we see that you have huge problems, but those are your problems. We're ready to buy Russian oil, but at a huge discount because we're also taking risks. The Americans might impose additional tariffs, so we need to cover those risks somehow. That's why it's heavily discounted. And today it became known that Russia is giving an additional discount to both India and China on its oil. Moreover, this discount, as of yesterday, is 4 times bigger than it was at the beginning of July this year. What else happened at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit? Well, publicly on display. This is the creation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's Bank. These are settlements in national currencies, free chains without politicization and so on. In fact, rather boring questions arise here. Who provides insurance? Where do you repair oil tankers? What will the European ports say? And here, a symptom appears in the news feed. One of the Chinese regional banks, which came under European Union sanctions, is stopping all operations with Russians. Here you go. Again, I'll quote Reuters on this. The Chinese say, we cannot risk our correspondent accounts for the sake of one region. Global business is much more important to us. There you go. Again, for Beijing, multipolarity, but this is where it ends, in the credit committee. So when they realize, well, listen, there's a risk of losing the Western market, it's better to close this bank for Russians. So let's sum up a bit in this episode. What did Russia get for its oil? They are forced to give a bigger discount, and Chinese banks refuse to work with Russians. Xi Jinping's multipolarity stops where risks appear. China is ready to buy Russian gas, again, at a discount. Power of Siberia-2. Well, for now it's only on paper that maybe it will be completed and maybe the Chinese will buy gas through it in the future. There was an episode that showed that Xi Jinping is absolutely confident and considers himself the main one in this duo, meaning China and Russia. And about how Xi Jinping didn't wait for dictator Putin to take a joint photo. This is a protocol detail that, better than any explanation, shows the hierarchy. Xi Jinping showed that. Oh no, Volodya Baldy, who are you? Well, of course, you're a partner, an ally, but know your place. There. And here's another interesting episode. It's about how Putin started to humiliate himself there. The thing is, this story with the reindeer, the thing is, Putin promised to give Xi Jinping reindeer as a sign of friendship and longevity. Well, when there are no big contracts, they put symbols on the table to, change the subject. At home, back in Russia, this is real diplomacy and such a poor time for Russians. Everything is great with us. Xi Jinping is pleased. The deer are already on their way. As for India, it's like the third corner of the triangle in the current trend. They stay distant, buy discounted oil, and negotiate with Americans for technology and tariff concessions. A long and telling quote from the Indian press: our region has lived with other people's conflicts for too long. India believes in partnership, not rivalry, in development, not dividing lines. We expect responsible behavior from everyone. To put it in plain language, New Delhi doesn't promise anyone anything and doesn't intend to make any promises. This as you understand, is bad news for Moscow, which dreamed of putting India, in the same line, supposedly creating a new China, India, Russia axis. As for the consequences for Ukraine, if Russia finds stable insurance for its shadow fleet, docks, banks, and all of this outside of Western infrastructure, then the Kremlin, of course, gets a chance to slightly prolong the life of its budget and its economy. Accordingly, an antidote might appear here. Europe and the United States need to introduce it quickly. This means tightening sanctions, banning all Russian ships from entering any Western ports. And this means banning Russians from being served in any banks around the world. There should be strict insurance filters, bans on repairing the shadow fleet in the European Union, Britain, and so on. There should be a clear audit of oil blends in third countries, as well as a timeline for each oil shipment. There's a lot of so-called magic there that can be easily dispelled by regulation. Because what do the Russians do? In India, among other places, they mix their crude oil. They claim it's not Russian, but from another country. And secondary sanctions, not only on large, but also on medium-sized Chinese banks, are already working best as well. As you can see, one of these regional banks actually just refused to serve Russians. Xi Jinping says they're switching to national currency settlements. That's why this Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit for this pair, Xi Jinping and Putin, it's not a marriage of love, it's a marriage of money. China is the cashier here and Russia is just, a customer. Multipolarity sounds impressive, but tankers need insurance, not just loud statements. That's why the strategy for the West is very simple. Hit the cash register, hit the budgets. So, as you can understand, when the summit ended and the microphones were turned off, that's when the real work began. At the summit, you could make many statements. But in fact, we see that there aren't really any effective, real results for Putin here at all. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode and subscribe to the channel. Let me remind you once again, every day there are 5 news stories here so that you stay up to date with all the events. And don't forget to leave a like, that's also very helpful. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.